Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this episode of the Better World Humans podcast. I'm excited to present to you our guest of the day is Dr. Michael Hames-Garcia. He studies and teaches about the inequalities of race, gender, sexuality, and disabilities in the criminal justice system, from policing and criminal courts to incarceration and reentry. His current research examines liberal responses to popular demands for racial justice. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement and defund the police. In our conversation today, you'll hear about why it's so important for us to focus on the local level of law enforcement, and also why we should reframe and rethink about providing people services instead of criminalizing addiction and poverty. Let's dive in. Welcome back to the Better World Humans podcast, Michael. It's great to have you on again. Before we get into the meat of our podcast, I'd love for you to tell the listeners a little bit more about yourself and you as a professor and your journey to getting to where you are at now.
Yeah, so well, it's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And so I started out in the early '90s in graduate school in an English department, and one of the things that was going on at that time was the tough on crime and lock them up kind of attitude in American criminal justice had been going on for a while, but it was about to kick into overdrive at that time with the Clinton crime bills in the early mid '90s, and a number of things at the state level. It was around this time that California passed its three strikes measure, and Measure 11 in Oregon, and similar laws in Washington created mandatory minimums. And so there was a big push both at the state and federal level at this time to drive prison rates up. And I saw that as the most important facing people of color in this country, way to address that. And since I was in English, the way to do that was to write about writings by prisoners. And so I decided specifically to look at what prisoners in the '70s and '80s, some political, some not, had to say about freedom and justice, and what that meant, and how that was different from what lawyers and philosophers were saying.
Yeah, and I know last time we talked about like this interest in the criminal justice system kind of was gradual, but what about being, a literature major made you want to shift kind of to actually studying a little bit more about the criminal justice system and how it really disproportionately affects people of color?
Yeah, so as I sort of progressed and wrote a dissertation, got my first job in an English department in New York, the kinds of questions that students brought, and the kinds of questions that I had, were ones that I couldn't answer just through the study of literature. Um, I used to describe it to some people as I had more in common with a sociologist who studied race than I did with an English professor who studied Shakespeare. So I found a way to move from English to ethnic studies, and to Oregon, which is where I grew up. So it was good to be back. Um, and I started to have the freedom in an ethnic studies department to teach broader classes on race and incarceration, on social equity and criminal justice, and really had to kind of, over the course of the last 15 years, put myself back to school and learn all of that interdisciplinary knowledge about how the criminal justice system works, why it is the way it is, how it evolved, how the courts work, the challenges facing people as they come out of reentry into society, and eventually policing, and the politics and history of policing. So that's my current research is on community oversight of law enforcement.
Right. And there's been a lot of, obviously conversations being talked about around police this year. And my next question for you is, how can we, navigate this almost reawaken? A lot of people are being, almost reawakened, like in the civil rights era, of like this this power that the police have, especially over minority groups of people. And how can we go forward in just trying to navigate and mitigate that power and try and get to a place where the more people aren't being locked behind bars?
It has to be something that a lot of people work on from a lot of different angles and perspectives. But what most people can do is to focus on the local level. So the vast majority of people in prison and jail and on probation and parole are are at the state level. So they're either awaiting trial at the state level, or in county jails, or they're serving short sentences in county jails, or they're serving longer sentences in state prisons. The federal prison system is comparatively very small, and so a lot of what has to happen. I mentioned that California's mandatory three strikes laws, which Californians have gone a long way toward addressing. I mentioned Measure 11, which is still on the books in Oregon, but Oregon is hopefully going to make some steps toward repealing that. There's a lot that has to happen at the state level. There's a lot that has to happen at the county level, where DAs are elected and sheriffs are elected and jails are typically run.
Are there certain counties or cities like in the United States that have a more progressive policy and are reducing some of these crime rates and reducing amount of people that are in our prison system?
There's a lot of interesting things happening everywhere. I'm excited to see what's going to happen with Portland, with the new DA. I think his name is Mike Schmidt, who was just elected last year, and on a program of criminal justice reform, very much following in the steps of Chesa Boudin in San Francisco, who is also an interesting progressive DA, who's pledged to fundamentally change how that office prosecutes, in particularly low-level nonviolent criminals. The DA for Philadelphia is another interesting one. And Los Angeles just elected a new DA as well, who's a reformer. So it's happening in a lot of different places. The thing is, it's just so early on. I remember when I used to teach about this, it was always clear to students that the DA wielded a lot of power in our country, in our criminal justice system, and so that was an important place to make changes. But since they're elected for decades now, they've been able to run on tough on crime policies, and that's how they win these races. So it's been hard for challengers to win, and I always thought that they wouldn't. But history's proving me wrong, and we are seeing waves of progressive DAs and judges, and even progressive sheriffs who are winning in the South on campaigns to not cooperate with ICE, for example.
So we're using this word progressive. I'm just curious, like, what does that progressive policy mean?
Yeah, so I think a focus on a number of things. I would sort of define a bare minimum, sort of the low bar, as not wanting to stay the course, recognizing and admitting that the strategies that we have had for dealing with crime have not worked. That what we've done is to target the poor. We have targeted the poor with incarceration, with excessive cash bail, with excessive fines, and that hasn't been good for the poor, and it hasn't been good for the rest of society. We've also targeted communities of color, and disproportionately, even in comparison with poor white, similarly situated economically poor whites. Um, we have also created a system that is incredibly harsh and unfair on two other groups, the unhoused and the mentally ill. And I would include as a mental illness, drug abuse disorder. Drug addicts are often find themselves, at least those who are targeted by the criminal justice system. They're at the one aren't the drug. We're not talking about the drug addicts who work on Wall Street. We're talking about the drug addicts who are also suffering from mental illness and also often unhoused. Right, they're the ones who have borne the brunt of a lot of our criminal justice policies. So, not staying the course, recognizing that there are problems, and the criminal justice system is one of them, and having an attitude that the way to improve that is in part to reduce the number of people in prison, in part to reduce the severity of our fines and fees and prison sentences, and a recognition that in order to actually deal with what we all agree are real problems in our society, we need to redirect resources. So we need to reduce the size of the prison system. We need to reduce the size of police forces. We need to reduce the size of sheriff's departments and direct those resources toward upstream solutions like better mental health care that is more accessible to everyone, better housing for the poor and those who are in bad circumstances, better upstream solutions for women who are in abusive relationships. There used to be in this country a whole network of women's shelters that were run by feminists, by volunteers, and created spaces for women to escape. That's all been kind of displaced by by police and district attorneys' offices, who see domestic violence as a law offense rather than as a problem with sexism in our society and unhealthy relationships.
Right. It's like we're just kind of trying to put a bandage on it instead of trying to actually stop the bleeding, or the
Yeah,
source of the
or
bleeding.
yeah,
Um,
if we think about it as a gunshot wound, we're trying to put a band-aid on it without even taking the bullet out.
right. And so, yeah, it's continually bleeding. And so with the, affordable housing, women's shelters, and, furthering access to mental health care, what are some of the steps that we can do to actually achieve this?
Create better systems for mental health care. This should be something that is available to anyone, and it should be available for free. We need to have a better social safety net so that people don't end up on the streets because they lose their job and they're behind on their rent. We need to be able to this is in the headlines now because of COVID and the eviction moratoriums that are about to expire, the extra Social Security benefits that are about to expire. We're going to have a massive housing crisis, and Eugene is a good example of a city that has. Since I have lived in Eugene, there have been conversations about the need for a secular homeless shelter, and it still doesn't exist. The city doesn't see it as a priority. It would rather allocate money to police patrols to move the homeless out of the way, rather than put that money toward good housing. Uh, Another thing that I think is important is and I know that you talked with Paul sponsors or Paul Solomon with sponsors, which does a lot of this work around housing, transitional housing. I think another really important thing that Oregon is finally taking a step toward is better addiction recovery resources. So a lot of the um, uh, one of the things that Measure 110 that was recently passed is going to do is to hopefully provide better support for those kinds of recovery houses and treatment centers.
Right. No, and that's something that is definitely needed. Is these recovery, like, instead of criminalizing people doing drugs, like, we should get them help. Like, you mentioned this story to me before about the person literally smashing car windows just to go to jail to get services. That seems quite backwards in my mind. And
Yeah.
I think that's a great step for Oregon. And you also mentioned that we don't necessarily know the long-term effects, but can you talk a little bit more about how important this year has been for raising awareness for the need for some of these progressive policies that are going to actually benefit all people?
Yeah. Gosh, just the year in general. It's been quite a year. I think that certainly you know, I I have been working and teaching on about these issues for gosh, almost 3 decades. That's hard to believe. Is that right? Almost 2 decades. Almost 2 decades. Okay, that makes me feel better. And no, almost three. God. So so I have some perspective, but I have to say, like, I did not see this year coming. I think that in retrospect, I know there was infrastructure being laid by um, radical reformers and abolitionists who have been um, creating grassroots organizations in the Bay Area, in New York, in Portland, all over the place for decades, uh, and have been uh, creating the possibility, right? Creating the possibility for a different conversation around criminal justice. I think that it at the time it seemed like it was coming out of nowhere, but it's because people had done that work to prepare the ground. And so when George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, there was a there was also this generation of young people, right, who had seen Ferguson and watched Ferguson unfold on their phones and their computers in real time, and seen other police violence since then, and sort of believed that surely someone was doing something about this. And when George Floyd was murdered, it was, I think, just too much for people. That the realization that no, things were not changing, that policing was happening the same way, and in a completely different location every time, right? Baltimore, Chicago, New York, Minneapolis, and people just said en masse no. And so I think that um, that has completely changed the conversation. Defunding was not on the table beforehand, defunding of police. And obviously, what that means is different to different people. Some people will say, oh, we don't actually mean defund, we don't actually mean abolish. But the interesting thing about this end of this year is that even if people are saying we don't actually mean that, they're talking about it. They're having to differentiate themselves from someone who actually believes that we should abolish the police. And what that looks like typically is the growing of alternatives so that they can crowd out the destructive aspects of the criminal justice system that we currently rely on for everything from petty squabbles between neighbors to serial killers to a panhandler, right? Why do we have the same person respond, the same institution responding to all three of those situations when we can have other possibilities?
Yeah, it's why do we? Yeah, why do we need to have police covering all these different alternative options, and having these alternative options is going to be in place to hopefully actually protect human lives. And instead of, killing people at the hands of police, we are going to be saving our human lives and, have less people in prison or people contributing to society. And as a final note, how can listeners just continue to bring about like real tangible change in criminal justice reform?
Yeah. So I mentioned before the Appeal, one of my favorite websites, theappeal.org. And it's a great way to stay informed, both nationally and at the local level. They have they did a wonderful piece on Oregon's DA elections earlier this year. A majority of Oregon prosecutors this year were people who had never run as a challenger. They had been appointed by, they'd previously been working in a prosecutor's office in Oregon, had been appointed by the governor when their boss stepped down, and then were able to run as an incumbent and are often running unchallenged. So Portland kind of broke that model this year with a progressive challenger DA, and Portland voters said, yes, that's what we want. We haven't seen the same success elsewhere in Oregon, but I think that we could, if people really look to that office as something that needs to change. Sheriff's departments are another. Our sheriffs are elected, but often also run unopposed. Often are very conservative on these issues. County commissions, people often don't pay attention to. They think, oh yeah, my city council, my mayor, but there's also a county commission typically that oversees the or is able to influence how jails are run and sheriff's offices are run. So in Lane County, right, we have the example of Eugene that has a really robust oversight system for its police officers, but nothing for the jail or for the sheriff's department. So that's a place where people can lobby their county commissioners to create something like that. I think that we often get distracted by the federal level, but there's a lot that we can do locally.
So it's continuing to educate ourselves on what's going around our local sphere is how we're going to probably make the biggest impact.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And voting and running for office.
Sweet. Thank you so much for your time today, Michael. It was great to talk to you again.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Better World Humans podcast. I hope you're feeling inspired right now. To find out more about what you can do, visit thebetterworldchallenge.com. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, because together we can really make the world a better place.